This is Covering the Spread. Here are your hosts, Jim Saunders and Dr. Ed Feng.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome on into Covering the Spread. That's right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network and numberFire.com as we are taking a look at betting NBA totals today with Carl Sack, taking a break with college football and a bit of a downtime to talk some NBA. My name is Jim Saunders. I am a senior writer and analyst for numberFire.com, joined here as always by Ed Feng. You can find his work over at thepowerrank.com and on Twitter at thepowerranked. We are talking NBA today. How you doing?
That's right. I'm doing great. Love a little basketball action to, give a little variety to the show and our listeners.
Yeah, and I think it's nice to get back into that groove. We talked a little bit of college basketball a couple weeks ago, which was good, and I think that as we get out of college football season, we're still going to talk college football. Next week, we'll talk some bowls. We'll talk about the semifinals, but it'll be nice to have a little bit more flexibility. We can talk about things beyond that. And this is something we'll talk about with Carl, but this is, if you want to do really well betting NBA or college basketball, do it when the books are focused on football. And I think that now is still that time, less so than it was earlier, but it's an advantageous time to be in these markets.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, I feel like there's a lot of interest in basketball now. At least I've seen that in just traffic on my site. Because I think people, they want to, if they're into basketball, they're going to be excited about the start of the season, and you get that preseason bump.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, plus it's helpful, too, for a system like yours where you can better account for off-season changes than, I can if I'm not using advanced numbers to account for those things. So I think that's
right.
It's also more advantageous for the Power Rank and for numberFire to have those things accounted for, because me, looking at things without data, it's hard to know what the impact of Kawhi Leonard and Paul George is going to be without looking at, data, which is why things like the Power Rank and numberFire are helpful in those arenas. Yeah,
absolutely.
So we're going to bring on Carl Sack. Carl is the lead consultant for NBA Wise Guys, which is over at sixthsensesports.com. Just search for or go to sixthsensesports.com for that. The NBA service there is led by Carl. He was also the lead handicapper at Sports Insights for 7 years before joining Sixth Sense Sports. Had a 54.6% win rate over there before going to Sixth Sense Sports. We're going to talk with him about the process of betting NBA totals and some lesser-known factors he accounts for when dabbling in that market, how he accounts for player injuries and the impact of those, some trends he's noticed, some guys he's been betting, teams he's been betting higher totals, or betting under the total for teams this season. Just kind of picking Carl's brain about totals. And at least in the NFL, I've always felt more comfortable betting totals. I'm going to talk about a total in covering the future today. What about you? Are you more of a sides guy or a totals guy from a personal perspective, from a betting perspective?
Yeah, I'm a guy who likes to go with what I think the better numbers are. Yeah. So, and that changes. I think, I put a lot of work in my college football sides, and I feel more comfortable with that now than my college football totals. I feel like the markets have gotten better. Mm-hmm. I need to quantify that, so I'll let you know about that in a couple weeks. But yeah, my totals model doesn't seem as good anymore, so I will switch over to college football sides. I've never liked my NFL totals model, so I haven't really talked about those much. That's something I plan to work on in the off season. And I just want to mention, that you talked about how Carl was over at Sports Insights and his 54%. That sample size is huge because he was over
1,900, I think.
It's a big number of games. So just definitely want to mention that. I've had a chance to know Carl for a bunch of years. And you always, when you're evaluating people, you always want to look at the size of their track record.
Right, exactly. So we're going to talk about Carl, and his strength is clearly betting totals. For me, it's there's a lot of overlap between totals and daily fantasy, which is where a lot of my other work is. So knowing your strength is a big thing. And Carl, I think, is a guy who definitely has that down. So we're going to talk to Carl in just a little bit. We'll have an NFL podcast coming up on Thursday this week. To make sure you get that in every episode of Covering the Spread, make sure you subscribe to Covering the Spread wherever you get your podcasts, whether it be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, wherever you can name, you can probably find us there. And while you're there, please leave a rating and review as well, because those do help us out quite a bit. And thank you to those of you who have done so already. Before bringing Carl Sack, though, want to go back to last week's college football episode. We talked about championship week with Bob Stoll, breaking down his favorite bets there. We're going to go back through that, and we'll go to Carl and talk about NBA totals.
Covering the past.
All right, last week on the college football version of Covering the Spread, we had Bob Stoll of Dr. Bob Sports on to preview championship week and break down some of those big games. Bob had Utah -6.5 and the under on 49.5 against Oregon, and the total actually closed at 46. So some pretty good closing line value for Bob there, but unfortunately that didn't matter, I guess, because the game did go over. Oregon won that game, and Ed, I have been skeptical of Justin Herbert. I feel like you have too, and
Yep.
Herbert wasn't necessarily the reason that they won that game, I wouldn't say. I think the defense played a major role, but a really impressive game overall by Oregon there.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like Utah, they played their bad game. They had been so impressive up until that point. They got gashed by a couple big plays, and we know by work from Bill Connolly that those tend to be random. Not to give Oregon credit for that, but definitely not Utah's game. And that'll be interesting to see how that projects into value on bowl games.
Right, exactly. And I think as it pertains to Herbert, I'm still skeptical. Obviously, he didn't do a ton in that game, and you look at his numbers, it's a lot of short passes, which I think is at least a minor red flag. But an impressive win by Oregon regardless. But that defense specifically balled out. They were good. Yeah,
for sure. And I think Herbert had a couple long passes, but they were kind of meltdowns by the Utah secondary as well. It's interesting, like, what I took away from this weekend, I didn't realize how good an athlete Joe Burrow was.
Yeah.
So,
he was I think he was all-state in basketball. I think that's the thing they always cite. Like, Ryan Fitzpatrick went to Harvard. Joe Burrow was like a great basketball player in high school. I think that's really
interesting, because Georgia's got some athletes on that defense, and he made them look dumb on a couple plays, and particularly the kid's going to win the Heisman, right? I don't know what the odds are, but
I think he's like -5,000, and the field is like, I was looking at this today.
Yeah, it's done. It's over.
I think.
But you saw his Heisman moment where he made a guy miss twice, and I've seen a bunch of LSU games this year, and it really didn't jump out to me until this game just how athletic he is, and he hasn't needed to. The accuracy.
Right, he hasn't needed to be that athletic because the offensive line has given him a lot of really good protection, but I think seeing that he can do that when he needs to is also really important, and he did that. So we'll talk about that game more in just a second. With Bob, he won Wisconsin plus 16.5 against Ohio State, along with the under on 56.5 points. Well, Wisconsin, first half was ridiculous. And both those did work out, Wisconsin did cover. They covered by 3.5 points. The under hit by 1.5 points. You mentioned that your numbers liked Ohio State too, and I understand the.
I mean, it was Wisconsin.
Like Wisconsin. I understand not wanting to bet them, but again, it's kind of like that Patriots game we talked about before, where it's got to be reassuring that at least your numbers are right, even if you didn't want to bet it.
Yeah, I ended up not betting Wisconsin.
Yeah,
and I was actually pretty happy I did, because Ohio State smashed them in the second half. I mean, it was kind of pure domination, and obviously when you look at the whole game, it was a much more even game, especially with what Wisconsin was able to do with some of the big plays. But I've been really impressed with what Ohio State's been able to do in the second half against Michigan and Wisconsin. Those are very good football teams, and they have simply dominated large parts of the second half. I know Wisconsin had a couple plays at the end. Ohio State could have easily covered in that game too. They ended up kicking a field goal late instead of going in for a touchdown as well. So I think in grand scheme of things, pretty happy. Laid off the game.
And I think that seeing them do this against these good defenses is impactful as they prepare to face Clemson, which will be probably the biggest test they've had all year. But I think that's it. They've passed some pretty serious tests there. And kudos to Bob on nailing both parts of that one. He also mentioned he leaned Oklahoma -8. He was, I think, hesitant to go there, and they justified that because he was talking about how Oklahoma has underperformed their advanced numbers all year long.
Right.
And even with Charlie Brewer out, they still went to overtime, and that was a wild game.
So Oklahoma, I mean, how much were they up late in the set? Were they up 10 late in the second half?
I don't know. I don't even know.
And Baylor benches their, or maybe they were up a touchdown.
Yeah.
Baylor benches their second string quarterback and brings in the third string, which you assume is a scrub.
Yeah.
And he like breaks off 2 huge plays that completely changed the character of that game.
Yeah.
Like I feel like you had to be feeling pretty good. Like I would have felt much better on that Oklahoma game than I ever did second half of that Wisconsin game.
That's true. Yeah.
So it just, the randomness of big plays and the breakdown in the Oklahoma, it was an interesting second half.
My Oklahoma plus 1100 to win the national championship, technically still alive. They're still only 10-1 despite making the playoff. So
right.
I'm going to cling to that one as long as we've got it. I've got it for 18 more days. I will cherish it in that time. I don't deserve it, but I'll take it. You mentioned Georgia, LSU, over 54.5, and the total went up after we discussed that one. It closed at 57 points, and Georgia got their end done, or LSU got their end done.
Right.
Georgia didn't, and I was disappointed because, they did lose a receiver during that game, but I thought Georgia's offense had the capability of scoring points when necessary, and they just had nothing on Saturday for whatever reason. It was weird.
Yeah, it was disappointing. They came out and they were pretty aggressive, and the receivers couldn't make plays. And
Jake Fromm hit a dude in the hands on consecutive plays downfield, and they dropped both. And I was just angry out of my mind. Yeah,
there was a couple missed field goals on both sides, so I feel pretty good about that bet. I don't regret that at all. But it's interesting to think long term about Georgia, because coming into the season, you have Fromm back, and I feel like Fromm's been pretty good. Mm-hmm. And you assume with the way Georgia recruits that they're going to plug and play with whatever receivers that they have. And I just don't think that worked out for them. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a cautionary tale when you're looking at college football teams in the preseason, replacing NFL level talent on a team like Georgia and just not being able to do that despite how well you recruit.
Right. And that was one of the reasons I was skeptical of Ohio State, but it can work the other direction, seeing teams struggle to replace NFL talent. And they lost all their pass catchers, so that would have been a red flag for Georgia. My hope, as someone who thinks that Jake Fromm has talent, is that they LSU this thing, go full Burrow. Let's run a modern offense and see what Fromm can do then. And if he fails to, open things up and go downfield then I'll abandon my take that he is actually a good quarterback. But I still want to see him running something where they do throw more downfield with receivers who can catch. I think that'd be great. But
his draft stock was reasonably high at the beginning of the year.
It was. Yeah.
Is probably not. I don't know.
I read far too many mock drafts in December, way more than I should.
That's good. That's information.
Yeah, he's generally a second rounder right now. I would not be shocked if he goes back. I think that if the prognosis for Tua had been worse, he may have declared, and he may still declare. But I think that with Tua's health looking better than expected, or at least than initially feared, I wouldn't be shocked if he comes back, and I would not blame him if he were to come back either. Usually I think the guy should always go pro, because too much weird stuff can happen. But for Fromm, I wouldn't be against him coming back. Final one here, I had Memphis minus 9.5 against Cincinnati, and they did win the game, but they needed a late touchdown to get there. They didn't cover. And they never really were in position to do so either. Cincinnati, I think, watching that game, I thought they outplayed Memphis. So, I don't know. I thought it was a tight game, and it could have gone. It was a coin flip about who won, but Cincinnati outplayed Memphis, and I think I underestimated that team in general in that game.
Well, and I think Memphis' defense had a bad game. Yeah. I'm not excited about what Cincinnati does on the offensive side of the ball, and they got it done that day. We had talked about, I think my numbers like Memphis' defense.
Yeah.
So, it's going to happen.
Yeah, and Desmond Ridder, played well coming back, so kudos to him for that, but no dice there. We'll talk about NBA totals in just a second. We're going to talk more college football later this year, too. We'll get some bowl previews and the semifinal preview, but for today, we're going to talk some NBA totals with Carl Sack. Again, he is the lead consultant for NBA Wise Guys at Sixth Sense Sports. Find his work at sixthsensesports.com. Before we bring on Carl, though, I want to remind you that if you want to get in on the action, check out the FanDuel Sportsbook and place your first bet today. If you lose, FanDuel will give you a refund of up to $500 in site credit. Visit sportsbook.fanduel.com for more details. Terms and conditions apply. Must be 21 plus and physically present in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, or Indiana. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Let's bring on Carl Sack now. Once again, find his work at sixthsensesports.com. We're going to break down his process for betting NBA totals and where he has seen different movement within this year. Let's talk some NBA. You're on Covering the Spread.
Covering the present.
Let's bring Carl Sack here into Covering the Spread, talking about NBA totals. Carl, been a pretty fun NBA season so far, it seems like. So how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing great. Appreciate it. And definitely tough for me as an NFL person, football person, to keep up with the NBA this time of year because there's so much going on. But it seems like it's been a fun year so far. For you specifically, how has NBA been going from a betting perspective?
Well, to be completely honest, it's actually been a slow start. I feel like I've had a pretty good feel on the market, on what's going on. But the variance has been there in not an optimal way. So it's been a slow start.
Yeah, variance is never fun, especially in these small samples, and we're still, only about a quarter of the way through the season. So it's definitely a lot of time for that variance to break back in your favor, hopefully. And the one thing we wanted to have you on here to talk about today, Carl, is totals, because, we talk a lot about sides here, specifically on the NFL side, but totals, they're just something that we tend to overlook here. So I wanted to spend a full episode talking with you about totals in the NBA, and you essentially specialize in betting totals. So from your process perspective, what do you think gives you specifically an edge in betting totals versus the other markets you could enter?
Well, I do probably bet about 75% totals. I think that the totals market is weaker in general, and I think most pros would agree that that's the case, and there's a reason why the limits at most sports books and in the market are lower for totals than sides, because I think that they're weaker. As far as the NBA in particular, I would say there's a few reasons, but to touch on a couple, I mean, I did I capped NFL for 3 years and hit 55%, and it was great. But, one of the downsides to the NFL is that there's only about 300 games a year, less than 300 games a year, whereas with the NBA, you get, I think it's like 1,300. So there's a lot more opportunities, and that makes the NBA appealing to me. I also did college basketball for 3 years and, again, had success there. But part of the issue with that, especially with totals, is that the limits are so low. Any book you hit with a max bet, they're going to move the line. If it's a small book, you're going to have trouble getting down what you want. If it's a larger book, then you're going to end up, like Pinnacle or Chris, you're going to end up moving the whole market. And that's, for someone like myself that runs a service, you want to be able to ideally get down with a few off screens and not influence the line, so that you're able to also give it out to customers and make sure that they can, get part of that edge as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Carl, really excited to have you on the show. I wanted to actually pick your brain about your
Thanks
process
for having me
for a long time. Obviously, pace is going to be something that you think about in terms of totals. But what are other metrics that you look for? And in particular, I'm thinking about stuff like, like rate at which teams foul at the end of games and push up the number of possessions. Tell us about that.
Well, that's an interesting one in terms of which teams are going to be more likely to hack when they're down 8 with 30. It's funny, you see that on a weekly basis. I'll see some team that I'm like, why are you fouling down 8 with 7 seconds left? And some other teams are fouling with a minute to go when they're down 11 or 12, and some teams don't. That's an interesting variable, and I think it kind of comes to fruition when you look at when you just kind of isolate how teams do in the last minute. I'll need to go through the box scores and look at the play-by-play for the last minute and see, has there been, you get some games where there's 20 points in the last minute because of a foul fest.
Right.
And so, yeah, it does help, in my opinion, to kind of look at games where you're thinking, okay, this could very well end up being a 4 to a 9-point game in the last minute, and there's an increased chance of a foul fest. Conversely, you get games where the spreads are double digits, and it's you're less likely to see that type of thing. I'll also look at injuries. I'll look at injuries and lineup changes. I think have outside of like pace, that could be certainly another indicator for trying to figure out where what an appropriate total might be. I do some work looking at referees. I look for coaching quotes. I think it was last week when Fizdale, who is no longer the Knicks coach now, but who he was talking. He actually had a couple of days off to do a practice, and he specifically in the practice they were running. Okay, let's shoot quicker in the shot clock. Let's get down. Let's focus on tempo. And so when you can get quotes like that, you tend to expect, all right, this might be a little bit of a high-scoring game. But I would say, for me, I think the most significant impact on totals, once you kind of get through the first 20 games where, some off-season changes are no longer a surprise, I think at that point you start looking at injuries and lineup changes as the major variables. And I can go into some examples if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, have there been ones this year specifically that have stood out to you as like guys whose roles have increased that have, led to those changes? Anything specifically you've noticed in that department for 2019?
Specifically thinking of roles that have changed. Off the top of my head, no. It's more so it's been injuries. It's been, for example, I think it was 3 games ago, Isaiah Thomas comes up with I think it's a calf strain. And he's the kind of player that makes a massive difference when it comes to totals. He's all offense, no defense. I think I had the numbers in front of me just a minute ago. It was like their defensive rating is 11 points worse when he's on the court. Their offensive rating is, I think, a couple points better when he's on the court, and they play a couple possessions per 48 faster when he's on the court. So if you just kind of do the math with that simple math, it's like it's not an insignificant thing. And then you throw in on top of it, Jordan McRae's out for them. He's another guard that has the ability to shoot the ball. Now they're running out Ish Smith for more minutes. Now he's a decent shooter, but he's a better defender than Smith, that's for sure. And he plays slower. And then now they're having to throw out Chris Chiozza, the rookie, who's shooting like 20% from the field on the season and plays slow. And so it's injuries like that. And from what I saw yesterday, he's going to be out for another week. So that's the kind of injury that that can have a really big impact. We've seen with the total they're playing today, that total opened 234, and now it's about 228.5 across the board, about 5.5 points. And the prior 3 games when he was out, you see the same thing. Like it's dropping. The market hasn't caught up, or at least the opening market hasn't caught up to that stuff.
Interesting. I want to go back to one thing you mentioned, and that was the spread and the way that can influence the way the teams play at the end of a game. And you were talking about how a tight spread may lead to more fouling at the end. A wide spread may lead to teams essentially giving up, packing it in. How much does the spread influence the way you view a total, if at all? Do the books do a good enough job of accounting for that? Or do you tend to bet different totals based on the spread?
I would say it does impact it a little, and I would say that I do not believe that the odds makers, based on the research that I've done, quantifying the historical results of games versus, games, totals results based on certain spread ranges. It is not factored in yet, I don't believe, not fully. So I do think that there is a little bit of that. I look at a lot of different things, and that's one of many. And it does have a little bit of weight, but certainly, as we kind of touched on before, like if you've got a high spread, there's a less likely chance of overtime. There's a less likely chance of a foul fest. You probably have some more inefficient backups that are in the, when it comes to garbage time. And then similarly, I want to know in garbage time, the nature of a team and their second and third units. For example, a team like Atlanta, Trae Young is pretty much the offense on that team. And he's also a below average defender. So if you get him out of the game in the last 5 minutes or 2 minutes or whatever, because it's a garbage time at that point, well, you can expect a lower scoring game in that garbage time. Whereas a team like, say, Milwaukee, that's deep and has shooters off the bench, you may not get that kind of result.
Fascinating. So, Carl, with all betting, timing is very important. NFL is a daily market where you're getting lines the night before. Do you have any advice about timing of your bets, when you find the most value, whether you maybe try to look late, try to fade the market, or what is your approach in terms of that?
I would say it's a mixture of, I would say most of the wagers that I make are either first thing in the morning within the first couple of hours, once limits are raised and most books have lines posted. It can get a little tricky if a team's on a back-to-back because they might be unlined. But I would say usually between about 9 and 11 a.m. Eastern time is when I'll start firing on some of those games. And then there's kind of a lull throughout the day. And you, at that point, then you're kind of waiting typically for the last hour or two before tip-off when you start getting injury clarifications or any kind of lineup changes, announcements on that kind of stuff. So for the most part, I would say it's typically first thing in the morning and right before tip-off.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned that there's been a lot of movement too, and I think that getting in there early can help account for that. Now, one of the reasons that there is movement, as you mentioned with Isaiah Thomas, is that we've got a lot of players potentially sitting, and that will have a big impact. What information do you use in order to get a read on how something like that will impact the total for the night? Are you looking at on-off splits, or what's the biggest source for you in trying to identify the impact of various injuries?
It's interesting that you asked that. So funny enough, so there's a few different things I look at, but interestingly enough, definitely on-off splits. Mm-hmm. And there was a advanced model that Ed actually helped build years back that I still use, that helps kind of factor in, what the different combinations of players, as opposed to just a simple, like, okay, one player on, one player off, or just looking at the starting lineup. So the short answer is definitely on-off splits. I try to adjust them and not just take them blindly, adjust them for strength of schedule, that kind of stuff. Certainly looking at pace differentials as well. And it'll be from the current season. It'll, in a season like this where we're still kind of early in the season, I might go back and look at last season, depending on how many minutes some of these players have. And then also some of it is just knowing the player historically. Like I think maybe a good example would be Carmelo Anthony. The last 5 teams he's been on or whatever, like the team's always been better without him. His defense has not been good. His offense has been okay. But now now he's on Portland, and in the first 10 games he's done all right statistically. But I'm more apt to say, okay, that's a small sample size. I know what Carmelo Anthony is historically, and I'm going to put a little bit more weight on my impression of what he is than the 10 games or so that he's played in this year. And that's certainly so that's part of it. But then I think something also that's important that sometimes goes overlooked is, okay, yes, how does what's the value of a certain player? But more importantly, what's the value, what's the value of the next player up and the next player up? Because Carmelo comes in and he's taking, like, Portland's really a very thin team. Zach Collins went down. So he's out. He was a starter. They lost They lost Harkless and Aminu in the offseason. They're starting a bunch of guys that are either unproven or very young. And so for him coming in and taking one of those players' spots, is he a significant downgrade from them? Probably not. But I'm not so sure I really consider him an upgrade either, right. Just based on knowing how he, does his thing. So the short answer to your question is I do look at on-offs. I try to look at some advanced metrics. I'll look at current season, sometimes past season, and sometimes just kind of an eye test and knowing certain players, knowing what their strengths and weaknesses are, just from, watching the game and being around it long enough.
Excellent. Carl, you mentioned all your numbers, which was fascinating. How much basketball do you watch in order to understand a guy like Carmelo Anthony?
Basketball is a tough, honestly, on average, probably like 2 games a day. It's hard, it's hard to watch all that, even if you can record everything and fast forward through the downtimes and the half times and commercials. And it does help with the eye test, in my opinion. I think another thing that helps with watching games is just knowing, especially from a referee perspective, is a ref just getting foul happy? And did we just see 10 extra points in this game because there were 5 fouls that were silly and shouldn't have been called? Those are things that are harder to get from the box score. Another thing that I think is undervalued in today's game, in today's market, I should say, is how open. If I watch a game and I see Milwaukee's getting open threes all day long, they're just missing them. Mm-hmm. I know they're getting the shot they want, and those are going to fall eventually. And I shouldn't say that you can only get that from watching the game, because the new player tracking data that they've had for the last few years, it's out there, it's quantifiable, and I do look at that as well. But it's nice to see it visually too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, are you betting totals in-game as well? And if you are betting in-game totals, while you're watching a game or whatever, are there certain things you lean on to give you a hint about which way to go there? Is it watching the referees? Is it watching, how tight the game is? What do you lean on when betting betting totals in-game?
Well, I should preface by saying I don't do a ton of in-game betting.
Yeah.
I do. There's a few instances that I'll target. Number one, and the most obvious, I think, is typically an injury that happens in the middle of the game. I don't think that that's factored in very well into either a live line or a second half line. So that's certainly an opportunity I'll look out for. Another instance might be, say I really like the under in a game, and I think these two teams match up well defensively, and first quarter, the two teams come out and they're just knocking down shots, especially contested shots, stuff like that. I'll be looking to in live bet my under again at a higher number, knowing that what's going on isn't sustainable. And not only that, but you come into halftime, in all likelihood, both coaches, if these two teams are shooting lights out first half, both coaches aren't going to come in saying, listen, we got to do more to score. They're going to be saying, hey, guys, play some defense. Focus on defense, please, Right. So I'd say those are probably the most obvious things obvious situations where I will bet something in game.
Excellent.
All righty. We appreciate you swinging by here, Carl. That's all the questions we have for today. Really appreciate you stopping by, chopping up some NBA and talking your process for betting totals. I really appreciate all the wisdom. It's definitely been interesting for me to hear it. I appreciate it, and hopefully we can talk to you again soon.
I appreciate you guys having me on. I could talk NBA all day, so you guys let me know whenever you want to chat.
I will happily do that. We'll be doing that again in the future. So good luck with your NBA betting until then.
Thanks so much. Have a great day, guys.
You too. Thank you.
Covering the future.
All right, one final big thank you to Carl Sack. Again, find his work over at the NBA Wise Guys at sixthsensesports.com. And Ed, fun to get a refresher on NBA because, I know you're heavily focused on college football and NFL this year. I am too. And, we talked about how it's a profitable time to be there. But, I I can't look at everything at once. So it's good to talk to Carl and get kind of a sense on some things he's seen so far this year.
There are not enough hours in the day. And actually kind of, like I know way more from a playing perspective about basketball than I ever will about football, just because I played. And, business is obviously taking me in the direction of football, and no regrets at all because I love the sport. I wish I had more time for basketball. I mean, even college basketball, which is actually part of my job.
Right.
I wish I had more time for that. Been engaging on this Michigan team pretty heavily, which has been fun. I've caught a couple other games, but it's still, it's hard to really do all that I want to do there at this point of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of have to know where you want to go. We can't bet on everything. So it's good to talk to guys like Carl who know the NBA and are paying that close attention and kind of lean on them this time of year when we can't do as much work there ourselves. Ed and I always preach searching for the best value in betting on games. Look no further than the new odds comparison our engineers have developed over at numberFire.com. It's called OddsFire. It is the premier odds comparison experience across major bookmakers in the regulated U.S. market. Compare odds, quickly identify the best value, and even examine first-party FanDuel data all in one place. Never settle, always get the best odds. Check out the experience for free now on numberFire or at oddsfire.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Ed, for your covering the future this week, you want to talk some college football, and we've got bowls coming up. And for bowl season, strength of schedule is obviously very important because these teams, a lot of them have faced wildly different teams. How does that relate to you when it comes to betting bowls?
So I was looking down my bowl predictions, and this Miami at Louisiana Tech game jumped out at me immediately in terms of the prediction. And strength of schedule is important. Strength of schedule is something that I trust myself to do really well. That's kind of how I got into this business, developing some of my own methods to do that. I also use methods that have been around forever as well. I think the mixture is a good thing. But so anyways, it's a place where I would tend to trust my numbers. And I do in this case. Miami is 6-6. That doesn't look particularly good. But they're 3-5 in one-score games this year. So they've been in every game. Like the only loss in which was not a one-score game was a 10-point loss to Duke in the season finale. And when you look at data from the season, I've talked about this before, but I put together points, yards per play, and success rate. Miami's 31st in the country, okay? And that's the second best in the ACC, which probably says more about the ACC than it does about Miami. But Miami is probably a lot better. Miami's definitely better than the 6-6 record that they have. They're actually best when you look at success rate. So that's something that's pretty good projecting forward for Miami. Then on the other hand, you have Louisiana Tech. They're 9-3. That's obviously a great record. But they play in Conference USA, which has been near the bottom in terms of conferences in college football in the bowl subdivision. So when you look at the same data from this year, points, yards per play, success rate, they only have one team that's above FBS average. That's Florida Atlantic. Western Kentucky is decent. They're near FBS average. And then there's a pretty significant drop-off to the next couple of teams. And Louisiana Tech is in that group. They're 90th. So this is one where I really trust my numbers. The numbers say Miami by about more than 15. I'm not ready to make a bet on this game necessarily yet. The spread is 7. Just need to look into some other things with Miami and their quarterback situation and some injuries that they have. Their top running back has been out the last couple of weeks. But this is one where I tend to trust my numbers. And then on the flip side, something where I'm actually really not trusting my numbers is this Oklahoma LSU game. It has LSU by 6.5 points. But you really have to hate what you see with this Oklahoma offense. They've turned from this explosive, mostly passing offense when they had the easier part of their schedule to an offense that's running Jalen Hurts more than 20 times a game. They're not explosive. They haven't been explosive, and not necessarily against the best defenses in the country as well. Ohio State hasn't, LSU's defense hasn't been great, but they're definitely in the category of defenses that I think is going to have a good chance of stopping and Oklahoma. And when you have a offensive wizard like Lincoln Riley and he's choosing to run his quarterback, I think that tells you something about what he believes his quarterback's passing ability is. It's kind of interesting too, because, I know they have a hotshot quarterback as his backup too. They've decided to stick with Hurts. So the market's at 11 something. I tend to trust that more than what my number in this case is putting out for the reasons that I mentioned.
And I think that having that knowledge of how your model works and where your model is strong and where it may not be strong is super valuable. And having that, that sample to know that is good. The Miami game, as of right now, is Miami minus 6.5. And I think the difficulty here is not everybody who's sitting out the bowls has necessarily announced that yet.
Right.
And that can make stuff like this pretty tough. Is that why you said you were hesitant to dive into the market there with that Miami game?
I mean, that's part of it.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what NFL prospects Miami has. I'm probably a little more concerned about the quarterback situation and who's playing. I guess I'm admitting here that I haven't really followed Miami as much as I'd like to this year. So just some homework I need to do.
That was okay.
The numbers.
Yeah.
I mean, you always find this game where you have kind of a big conference team against a Conference USA team that has a much better record, and those are games in which I trust my numbers.
Right, because there's such a split, and I think that it does make a lot of sense to do that then. So if you have a good read on the quarterback situation, you can get Miami at minus 6.5 right now over at FanDuel Sportsbook. Now, because we don't have a college football show this week, I want to focus on the NFL both today and on Thursday. I'll give another one on Thursday, but the one I want to focus on here is I want the under on Titans versus Texans with the total at 50 points. And I'll talk about the Titans at the end of this, Ed. So if you want to pull up numbers there, they're a very interesting team, but the total right now for this game is the highest of the week at 50 points. And I think the reason I want the under here is largely because both these teams are pretty decently run heavy. The Texans are at league average at 54% for their pass rate on early downs in the first half. That's according to Sharp Football Stats, which is about league average. The Titans are at 51%, which ranks 24th if you look at their full season numbers. But they've been, obviously, as you can see, a very different team with Ryan Tannehill at quarterback. So we can't look at full season stats with Tennessee. We have to look at what they've done since Ryan Tannehill became quarterback. And you may think that their run rate may be lower with Tannehill because he's been far more efficient than Marcus Mariota. It's actually lower. Like, their pass rate is lower with Ryan Tannehill at quarterback than it was with Marcus Mariota, specifically on early downs in the first half. So it's not because they're winning. They're just run heavier for whatever reason it may be. Their pass rate is just 50% on early downs in the first half with Ryan Tannehill at quarterback. So they're still running the ball a ton, which is not a bad thing. I'm not criticizing them because Derrick Henry.
I am.
Yeah. You can. That's fair. Derrick Henry is a beast. I get it. I understand it. But it does keep their pace down. I think that's the key reason why I'm looking at the total here, because they are still 27th in situation-neutral pace, according to Football Outsiders. Titans games have consistently been going over recently because of how efficient their offense has been, but I think that when you put this number at 50, it basically means you are assuming that they maintain freakish efficiency levels, both as a passing offense and as a rushing offense, and I'm skeptical that happens. I respect Ryan Tannehill, what he has done, and I think that it is very noteworthy, but this is an outdoor game. It's in December. Any trickiness with weather could lead to this number going lower as the week goes along. As of right now, winds are projected at 7 miles per hour, so nothing to worry about there, but that could always change as the week goes along. So we're recording Tuesday. I'm going to take advantage of that and talk about this total here. I want the under on 50. If you look at numberFire, their total is 44.5. I don't know if that's fully accounting for Tannehill, but if I can get under 50, I'm going to take it. So I want the under on 50 here. But Ed, I want your thoughts on the Titans because I was very, 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 very wrong on Ryan Tannehill when he became the starter here. But it's still a small sample. So what's your read on the Titans right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I mean, I think, my number on the total in this game is 48. Seems a little, obviously there's a lot of Mariota's data in there as well. But it does suggest the under. I think it's, I don't know. I don't have a great read on this Tennessee team.
I never have in my entire life.
I'm surprised that you even mentioned this team after with how much you like Mariota. So
I mentioned them a lot on Slack. Usually it's me being mad about Tannehill making another disgusting throw, and I'm just like, why does he keep doing this? It's like the Breaking Bad moment where Jesse is just screaming, he can't keep getting away with this. That is me with Ryan Tannehill, but it keeps happening. And like, I'm not saying they're going to lose. I'm not saying Texans +3, but I do want the under here because they're both crazy run heavy, or the Titans are still very run heavy, but like, they're a hard team to get a read on, but I think I want the under here.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems reasonable to me.
We'll talk more NFL coming up on Thursday this week, so make sure you subscribe to Covering the Spread wherever you get your podcasts. It can be Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher. You can find us there, and while you're there, please leave a rating and review as well. Ed, you were talking about the bowls. We know your email newsletter. Anything special for bowl season over at the Power Rank?
Yeah, I'll have a bowl report out probably by tomorrow, and the full version has a lot of notes on injuries and situations and matchups. But yeah, bowl season report is basically the only time of year where you can get my best predictions without signing up as a member at the Power Rank. So yeah, that's exciting, and I will probably talk a lot about that over the next 3 shows, I guess.
Awesome. We're looking forward to that. Of course, we'll talk more college football next week as well right here, and get that in. You can get Ed's numbers over at thepowerrank.com, and you can follow Ed on Twitter at thepowerrank. I am at Jim Sannes, JimSannes. You can also follow the FanDuel Podcast Network at FanDuel Podcast. Big thank you to Calvin Theobald running the video side of things for today. Thank you, Cal, as always, for keeping us on the airwaves. And a thank you to Carl Sack. You can find his work over at sixthsensesports.com to get his thoughts on the NBA. Thank you to everyone for tuning in for today. Back on Thursday with more NFL talk to get you set for Week 15. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll talk to you then. This has been Covering the Spread right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network.